Hello, we are going to look at C.S. Lewis's magnificent work, The Four Loves, today, coming towards the conclusion of the course. And I have saved, in some senses, the best to the last, having looked at in the last few weeks at Till We Have Faces and also Mere Christianity. I've talked about throughout the entire course, however, of the importance of love in understanding Lewis's entire corpus of works, and in fact his entire intellectual world, because I said, as I emphasized at the outset, there is a consistency and a coherence throughout all of Lewis's works, irrespective of the genre, whether it's a literary criticism, whether it's fiction, or whether it's what we might identify as philosophical or apologetic works. And in this, I think the common thread that unites them all is the idea of love. And in that, he is modeling himself, it seems to me, along the lines of the great theologian St. Augustine. Now, I say that because here in this work, towards the end, when he comes to the fourth of the four loves that he describes, agape love, he takes issue with Augustine on something that Augustine says. I think he misunderstands Augustine on this point, or at least quotes a section of a work, namely the Confessions, in which Augustine's not making a statement about love per se, but rather about a stage in his life and his understanding at that particular stage. But I will set that aside for one moment. Let's begin with the idea of love being the leitmotif of Lewis's whole work. And he begins this work by quoting St. John, stating that God is love. And we saw when we looked at Till We Have Faces, that was precisely the topic that was of central interest, because, of course, it was the myth, the mythological retelling of the myth of Cupid and Psyche, with Venus lying behind that all. And of course, these are Venus being the goddess of love, Cupid her errand boy, as it were, and Psyche, of course, representing the soul who is loved by Venus. A wonderful tale, Lewis's best fictional work. So with this, he comes back to the topic, and he comes at it for the second time, I would say, in terms of a non-fictional portrait as a central interest, because earlier on in his literary life as a scholar, he wrote a great work called The Allegory of Love, which we have not dealt with here on this course, just simply for reasons of time, rather as much as anything else. But it was the first work that I actually read by C.S. Lewis. I read it in a course that I did on Chaucer and his age. And I was captured very much by what he wrote there and found it fascinating. But he revisits that, and he actually mentions that work in this work, that he had earlier conceived of things in a certain way and merely as a fictional portrait, because in The Allegory of Love, he argues that the modern conception of romantic love owes itself to its discovery in the 12th century courtly love tradition. But here he somewhat recants that view and says that although he once thought that, he now realizes that it is fundamentally true of the human condition, that there is a sort of an allegory. There are types of loves, and all of them are allegories of divine love. So it's not just something that was invented in the Middle Ages. It's characteristic of love as he defines it. And for me, I said that the Till We Have Faces was his best fictional work. I actually think that in some ways this is his best apologetic work, although I will rarely find anyone to agree with me on that. But the reason I say that is because the theme is so important, and I believe that he deals with it particularly well. I want to begin, having said that, then, not with a quotation from Lewis, but with a quotation from a passage in Augustine. This is from On Christian Teaching, De Doctrina Christiana, right at the outset. And I think the reasons for quoting it will be clear in a minute. Augustine at the outset of this, now this is On Christian Teaching, the first 3 books of 4 in this are written actually on Christian learning. And the fourth of the 4 chapters is finally on Christian teaching, but the first is how do we read? And then finally he gets to how do we teach, given the way we need to learn to read. But he gives an analogy here, does Augustine, after having made a distinction. And the distinction he makes is that there are some things which are to be enjoyed, some which are to be used, and some whose function is to be both to enjoy and to use. Now, those which are to be enjoyed make us happy, and those which are to be used assist us and give us a boost, so to speak, as we press on towards our happiness. What Lewis is arguing here in the 4 loves is that the 4 natural loves that he, or the 3 natural loves rather, that he describes are all forms of utility. They are used in order to drive us towards the final of the 4 loves, agape love, which is the love of God, which we are there to be to enjoy for itself alone. And then he gives an analogy, does Augustine, and it's the analogy of a journey. But I'll read a little bit more, and then it'll come to Augustine's analogy here. He says, to enjoy something is to hold fast to it in love for its own sake. To use something is to apply whatever it may be to the purpose of obtaining what you love, if indeed it is something that ought to be loved. The improper use of something should be termed abuse, said Augustine. So it's what Lewis is going to describe as a denaturing of our loves, a turning away from the way in which they actually point to God, and rather point in the direction of what he in The Great Divorce describes as the gray earth, or purgatory, or hell. That's the direction they point in. But he says, so here's the analogy. Suppose we were travelers who could live happily only in our homeland, and because our absence made us unhappy, we wish to put an end to our misery and return there. We would need transport by land or sea, which we could use to travel to our homeland, the object of our enjoyment. But if we were fascinated by the delights of the journey and the actual traveling, we would be perversely enjoying things that we should be using. And we would be reluctant to finish our journey quickly, being ensnared in the wrong kind of pleasure and estranged from the homeland where pleasures could make us happy. So, in this mortal life, we are like travelers away from our Lord. 2 Corinthians 5, verse 6. If we wish to return to the homeland where we can be happy, we must use this world, cf. 1 Corinthians 7, verse 31, not enjoy it. In order to discern, quote, the invisible attributes of God, which are understood through what has been made, Romans 1:20, or, in other words, to derive eternal and spiritual value from corporeal and temporal things. And then he concludes by saying, the things which are to be enjoyed then are the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, and the Trinity that consists of them, which is a kind of single supreme thing shared by all who enjoy it. And this is the only thing that is to be enjoyed. Now, this is where Lewis is going to conclude his work. With that discussion of the Trinity. And you'll recall back in Mere Christianity, in the 4th book, he concludes with a discussion of the Trinity. In his in the title, it's Beyond Personality. And the personality there is the idea of personhood, which is a self-referential one, in which either the psychologists have spoken of us having personalities, or we ourselves, in accordance with our natural loves, see ourselves as a kind of personality unto ourselves, rather than as an image of God, God himself being in his nature the Trinity. I say that, though, at the outset, because we're going to find here very quickly, early on, he also gives another analogy, and you might recognize a similarity here. But he begins by making a distinction which he's going to build upon throughout the entire work, and which I'm therefore going to need to address to some degree here. And the distinction is that between what he calls gift love and need love. The typical example of gift love would be that love which moves a man to work and plan and save for the future well-being of his family, which he will die without sharing or seeing. Of the second, need love, that which sends a lonely or frightened child to its mother's arms. Again, two analogies. If there was no doubt which was more like love himself, divine love is gift love. The Father gives all he is and has to the Son gives himself back to the Father and gives himself to the world, and for the world to the Father, and thus gives the world in himself back to the Father too. If you're interested in a scriptural, extended scriptural meditation on that, look at John 17. And what, on the other hand, can be less like anything we believe of God's life than need love? God lacks nothing. But our need love, as Plato saw, is the son of poverty. It is the accurate reflection and consciousness of our actual nature. We are born helpless. As soon as we are fully conscious, we discover loneliness. We need others physically, emotionally, intellectually. We need them if we are to know anything, even ourselves. And my understanding from psychological studies is that a child even above nutrition and shelter needs love. And for that reason, when children are born these days, they no longer remove the child immediately from the mother as they once did. They place her on him or her on the mother's bare chest, so that there's that sense of attachment. Just a slight acknowledgement of the importance of the presence of another, and the love and the beating heart that was once experienced from the inside and is now by the baby experienced from the outside for the first time. But he says, on the other hand, having said all of that, he says, I cannot deny the name love to need love. And this is where he begins. And in terms of a structure here, what he is laying down here in the four loves, the first three loves, I would say, are run parallel to what he in Mere Christianity describes as the cardinal virtues, or the temporal virtues. These are loves that are recognized by the world. It's not that the virtues and the loves are the same thing, but these are earthly goods, and there are goods in them, and that includes the needs that is a part of each of the four that he's going to describe. And he is going to say that there is a need component to each of the four loves, and also a gift component to each of the four loves. And although the gift component is infinitely greater, it is not the case that we can dispense with the need love. In fact, he says that the greater is rooted in the lesser. And we must not consider love to be something that is separated from a physical need, because, of course, God created us in a needy way, even from the very beginning before the fall. We were created with need loves, and so we must not deny that need love is an actual love. But that's where he begins with this. Is in making that distinction, and then talking about how he used to regard need love as not true love, and gift love as true love, and now he builds upon this. And in this, I think he is engaging with Augustine's discussion of love. And this is why I think Lewis, as a theologian, is most profound on this topic in this particular book. And it has been too little acknowledged to my in my opinion. But he says this here right in the very introduction: every Christian would agree that a man's spiritual health is exactly proportional to his love for God. But man's love for God, from the very nature of the case, must always be very largely and often entirely a need love. This is obvious when we implore forgiveness for our sins or support in our tribulations. But in the long run, it is perhaps even more apparent in our growing, for it ought to be growing, awareness that our whole being by its very nature is one vast need, incomplete, preparatory, empty, yet cluttered, crying out for him who can untie things that are now knotted together and tie up things that are still dangling loose. I do not say that man can never bring to God anything at all but sheer need love. Exalted souls may tell us of a reach beyond that, but they would also, I think, be the first to tell us that those heights would cease to be true graces, would become Neoplatonic or finally diabolical illusions. So we must not divorce ourselves from our bodily nature and from our creaturely needs. That is our, I want to say our lot. That is our great grace as being creatures of God. We are always and ever dependent on him and need him at all times. And so he says, thus, in scripture, it says, come unto me, all ye that travail and are heavy laden, or in the Old Testament, open your mouth wide and I will fill it. So thus, he says, one need love, the greatest of all, either coincides with or at least makes a main ingredient in man's highest, healthiest, and most realistic spiritual condition. And a very strange corollary follows. Man approaches God most nearly when he is in one sense least like God. Isn't that interesting? When he acknowledges that there is nothing of God in him, when he acknowledges that he is a base worm, when he acknowledges that he deserves nothing of God, that is when he comes closest to God. At that point, he is humble, and humility is the first step after the fear of the Lord in the ascent towards an understanding of who God is and being like him. So Lewis here agrees with this. And so he then goes on to describe, and he's going to give this analogy, which I think in some ways connects with Augustine's analogy here. And I'm coming to this now. But he says in order to understand this, we need to understand two things and distinguish them, which might be called being near to God. What are these two things? One is likeness to God. There's a likeness to God from being made in the imago Dei, the fact that we have the capacity for speech, unlike the animals, the fact that we have rationality, this makes us like God, the fact that we have a sense of moral right and wrong, we can appreciate and understand justice. In this sense, we are like God. But secondly, so firstly is we are like God. We're made in imago Dei, in his likeness. The second is a different type of nearness. It's the nearness of approach. If this is what we mean, then it's more like a journey. Nearness is coming towards him, as in moving in the direction of God. And so now he gives the analogy, and you can see that Augustine had just talked about this as a journey, and life is a journey. So here's Lewis's analogy. Let us suppose that we are doing a mountain walk to the village which is our home. At midday, we come to the top of a cliff where we are in space very near it, that is the village, because it is just below us. We could drop a stone onto it. But as we are no cragsmen, we can't get down. We must go a long way around, 5 miles maybe. At many points during that detour, we shall statically be far further from the village than we were when we sat above the cliff. But only statically. In terms of progress, we shall be far nearer our baths and teas. So you can see, in terms of resemblance, we're very close. We're most like him when we're at the top of the mountain and the village is down below us. Very clear. Very near, but we can get no nearer. Whereas when we start going back down the mountain and get further away, we nonetheless are moving in the direction of the village, which is our home, hence the journey. Since God, then, he says, is blessed, omnipotent, sovereign, and creative, there's obviously a sense in which happiness, strength, freedom, and fertility whether of mind or body, whether they appear in human life, constitute likenesses, and in that way proximities to God. But no one supposes that the possession of these gifts has any necessary connection with our sanctification. No kind of riches is a passport to the kingdom of heaven. At the cliff's top, we are near the village, but however long we sit there, we shall never be any nearer to our bath and our tea. So here the likeness. And in that sense, we are as near to God, and every creature is, as we can possibly be. In that sense, because everyone, however wretched a sinner they are, is bearing the image and likeness of God, and that image is not blotted out by sin. It's defaced. It's not effaced or erased. What is a different sort of likeness is drawing near to him. So he says, nearness of approach by definition is increasing nearness. And whereas the likeness given to us, and which can be received with or without thanks, and it can be used or it can be abused, to use Augustine's phrase, the approach, however initiated and supported by grace, is something we must do. Creatures are made in their varying ways images of God without their own collaboration or even consent. It is not so that they become sons of God. And the likeness they receive by sonship is not that of images or portraits. It is in one way more than likeness, for it is a unison or a unity with God in will. But this is consistent with all the differences we've been considering. Hence, as a better writer has said, our imitation of God in this life, that is our willed imitation as distinct from any of the likenesses which he has impressed upon us, on our natures or states, must be an imitation of God incarnate. Our model is the Jesus, not only of Calvary, but of the workshop, the roads, the crowds, the clamorous demands and surly oppositions, the lack of all peace and privacy, and the interruptions. For this, so strangely unlike anything we can attribute to the divine life in itself, is apparently not only like, but is the divine life operating under human conditions. So it is a journey. It is a movement towards God in the midst of being in the midst of unlovable things and living in the bodily life. Here's the problem. Every human love at its height, however high it stands, has a tendency to claim for itself a divine authority. He's going to describe that in describing the four loves, which I'll get to in a minute. And the reason why they claim authority is because the authority's claims he's going to describe are plausible to us. Not just because we're delusional, but because there is something of them that really does have an analogy to the love of God, which is the fourth, the agape love. So with all of that, the introduction being stated, which is necessary for me to present here, because quite frankly, he is going to refer back to that discussion in the discussion of the four loves, so I'm not going to skip over it for that reason. He will say that these two sorts of pleasures foreshadow the loves as he will entirely present them. And he builds on that, and then he also talks about two other types of pleasure. And there are need pleasures on the one hand, and then there are pleasures of appreciation. Now, need pleasures are those which get satisfied. And he says we tend to speak of these in the past sense. So when we have a drink of water, we say, oh, I needed that. Or when we, and we're driven by a need in the sense, and when it's satisfied, we regard it as no longer present to us. So there's a need pleasure. And on the other hand, a pleasure of appreciation. And the pleasure of appreciation, he says, makes us feel that something lies that has not merely gratified our senses, but claimed our appreciation by right. So it's almost like an ideal, and it's an ideal that is never met. And it's that sense of the pleasure of appreciation which is most divine in its in its appearance. And now he's going to make a comparison. This is, by the way, in the first chapter after the introduction. What's the chapter titled Likings and Loves for the Subhuman. Actually, I'm going to skip over this just for lack of time, but the summary here, which he gives. Need love cries to God from our poverty. Gift love longs to serve or even to suffer for God. Appreciative love says, we give thanks to thee for thy great glory. Need love says of a woman, I cannot live without her. Gift love longs to give her happiness, comfort, protection, if possible, wealth. Appreciative love gazes and beholds its breath and is silent, rejoices that such a wonder should exist even if not for him, will not be wholly dejected by losing her, would rather have it so than never have seen her at all. So, and all of these then, in the end, tend towards worship. And this is the third element to love, which I want to conclude with before going on to the four distinct loves that he describes. He says there's a third element in love, no less important than gift love and need love, and that is this. And it's foreshadowed by our appreciative pleasures, he says. And this is the judgment that the object is very good, and that this attention, almost an homage, offered to it as a kind of debt, this wish that it should be and should continue being what it is, even if we were never to enjoy it, can go on out not only to things but to persons. When it is offered to a woman, we call it admiration. When to a man, hero worship. When to God, worship simply. So there's an element of worship in all of our loves that is the highest form of those, which Christians understand here. So having said all of that, as a prelude and a necessary prelude, let me get to the four loves now, as he describes. The first one is called what we tend to call affection. He uses the Greek word for it here. He calls it storge. Storge is, and I quote, affection, especially of parents to offspring. In that sense, it could be called filial love. That's what we would call it in what King Lear calls it, when his daughters do not reciprocate the love which he claims to bear towards them. He speaks of their filial ingratitude, the ingratitude of children for a parent. But it's also, so it's the affection of parents to the offspring, but also the offspring to the parents. And that, I have no doubt, is the original form of the thing as well as the central meaning of the word. The image we must start with is that of a mother nursing a baby. A bitch or a cat with a basket full of puppies or kittens, all in a squeaking, nuzzling heap together. Purrings, lickings, baby talk, milk, warmth, the smell of young life. The importance of this image is that it presents us at the very outset with a certain paradox. The need and need love of the young is obvious. So is the gift love of the mother. She gives birth, gives suck, gives protection. On the other hand, she must give birth or die. She must give suck or suffer. Her own, remember, he has the idea of begetting here. Something of herself must be passed on or she will cease to exist. That's the paradox. Her affection is also a need love. There is the paradox. It is a need love, but what it needs is to give. It is the gift love, but it needs to be needed. We shall have to return to this point, he says. And it is part of the home, the family. So what he speaks now of affection or storge is that which is most connected with familiarity, not just with the family, but with all objects around the family. Things that become familiar to us are what he will talk about relating to storge. And he says it can exist between a clever young man from the university and an old nurse. Even though their minds inhabit different worlds, it ignores even the barriers of species. We can see it between a dog and a man, but also between a dog and a cat. We can even see it between a horse and a hen. It's a warm comfortableness. He says it's the least discriminating of all loves. Anything seemingly can be an object of our affection, but he says it does have its own criteria. Its objects have to be familiar. We can sometimes point to the very day and hour when we fell in love or began a new friendship. I doubt if we ever catch affection beginning. It's familiar. It's familiar, and it is bred of familiarity. And the flip side of it is that, as we say, the proverb in English, familiarity also breeds contempt. But it also breeds this particular variety of affection. Affection is the humblest love, he further says. It gives itself no airs. It has a very homely face. In British English, homely is more literal than it is in North American English. In British English, it's the love that is related to things that are connected to the home. So if in British English you say that girl is very homely, you do not mean that she's unattractive. You mean that there's something of home in her that reminds you of a thing, and you find her very comfortable and easy, and so forth. So affection has a very homely face, Lewis says, and so have many of those for whom we feel it. It is no proof of our refinement or perceptiveness that we love them, nor that they love us. What I have called appreciative love is no basic element in affection. It usually needs absence or bereavement to set us praising those to whom only affection binds us. We take them for granted. And this taking for granted, which is an outrage to erotic love, is here right and proper up to a point. It fits the comfortable, quiet nature of the feeling. It's unreflective. Affection would not be affection if it was loudly and frequently expressed. To produce it in public is like getting your household furniture out for a move. It did very well in its place, but it looked shabby or tawdry or grotesque in the sunshine. It stays there. On the other hand, affection, he is going to say, will often be combined with other forms of love. One of the more remarkable byproducts of affection, Lewis says, is not yet been mentioned, and that is it is not primarily an appreciative love. It's not discriminating. It can rub along, he says, with the most unpromising people. Yet, oddly enough, this very fact means that it can, in the end, make appreciations possible, which, but for it, might never have existed. We may say, and not quite untruly, that we have chosen our friends and the woman we love for their various excellences, for beauty, for frankness, goodness of heart, wit, intelligence, or whatnot. But it had to be the particular kind of wit, the particular kind of beauty, the particular kind of goodness that we like. And we have our personal tastes in these matters. That is why friends and lovers feel that they were made for each other. They're particular, these other loves. The especial glory of affection, on the other hand, is that it can unite those who most emphatically, even comically, are not made for each other. People who, if they had not found themselves put down by fate in the same household or community, would have had nothing to do with each other. If affection grows out of this, and of course it often does not, their eyes begin to open. Growing fond of those around you, however difficult they are. So he says affection broadens our minds. And of all the natural loves, it is the most Catholic, the least finical, the broadest. It will accept all manner of things without discrimination. On the other hand, he goes on to say, affection opens our eyes to goodness we could not have seen, precisely because it's undiscriminating. It allows us, it brings us to associate things that we would never have chosen to associate with us. And for that reason, it broadens our sense of tolerance of things that we are not naturally inclined to like. And he says it opens our eyes to goodness we could not have seen or should not have appreciated without it. So does humble sanctity, Lewis adds. By itself, simply left to its own devices to follow its own bent, it can darken and degrade human life. The debunkers and anti-sentimentalists, by this he's referring to the home, have not said all the truth about it, because in the Victorian era they praised the virtues of home life. We often hear it in our day praised precisely because there's so little about family life that is praised in the media. Everything is public and the working world, and very little is said about the value of the home. But the Victorian era very much valued the home, to the point Lewis thinks of idolatry. So Lewis's comments here probably pass by us without any real appreciation. And he will then talk about the perversion of this sort of love in the same terms in which he discussed it in The Great Divorce, of a mother who says that she is giving to her child, and her child is desperately trying to get away from the child, because the child recognized that there's a neediness in the mother, which is imposing itself as a sort of a sacrificial and in some ways a martyr's love, which the child does not want. So this is the perversion of storge that he says in this. But in its proper sense, and in its sense that it is a true love, he says there's a common ground between public or private affection and the affection that we display in public. And he says the root principle is the same, that no one give any kind of preference to himself, any kind. So that's how he describes affection, and I think I will skip over what the rest of he says here, because I want to get on to some of the higher forms of love. But it must be said here that affection is responsible for 9/10 of whatever solid and durable happiness there is in our natural lives. So this is something. He's going to move on to higher forms of loves that we choose. But he says that 9/10 of our of whatever solid and durable happiness that's in our lives comes from familiarity, of those sorts of affections. And it produces happiness if and only if there is common sense, however, and give and take and decency. In other words, this is the final word, only if something more and other than affection is added. The mere feeling that we have for people who are familiar to us is not enough. You need common sense. That is, you need reason. You need give and take. You need justice, the very things that he described at the outset of mere Christianity. There needs to be a sense of justice that overrules the familiarity, the familiar needs and so forth, even within the home. So what is this? There's no disguising the fact that this means goodness, justice, patience, self-denial, humility, and the continual intervention of a far higher sort of love than affection in itself can never be. That is the whole point. If we try to live by affection alone, affection will go bad on us. With that said, then, let me move on to what he writes about friendship. And I want to begin by saying that what Lewis describes here in his section on friendship, I think, is glorious. My first comment, I think it's wonderful. I also think that he makes comments about it which I think are telling. And what he says is that of all of the loves which he is going to discuss, this is the one that most people have never experienced. It's a love, on the other hand, that the ancient world most prized of all. Aristotle spoke of friendship as a school of virtue. And the reason that friendship was most highly prized in the ancient world is because it had no connection with bodily life, and to some degrees, I think it lies in their understanding of anthropology. because remember, they had their mind body dualists, or soul body dualists. The soul is good, the body is evil. And friendship has nothing to do with the body. It's two individuals that will behold the good and the just and the beautiful, and they will look at that. And so friendship escapes the necessity and the bodily necessity of both storge, familiar love, and also that of erotic love. However much the ancients will regard erotic love as a goddess like Venus, and will also regard, of course, there's a goddess of the hearth and home. Nonetheless, they value friendship above all. But in our world, Lewis says that we don't. I'll suggest reasons why I think that isn't the case shortly. But to that, Lewis says, to the ancients, friendships seemed the happiest and most fully human of all loves, the crown of life and the school of virtue, quoting Aristotle there. So this is the quintessential love in the ancient world. And he says, we admit, of course, that besides a wife and a family, a man needs a few friends. But the very tone of this admission, he says, and the sort of acquaintanceships which those who make it would describe as friendship show clearly that what they are talking about has very little to do with the philia which Aristotle classified among the virtues, or the amicitia on which Cicero wrote a book. And if you're wanting to look at that, have a look at what Aristotle says on friendship, and I believe in this in the Nicomachean Ethics, or what Cicero wrote on friendship, amicitia. And he says it's something in our lives which is quite marginal. It's not a main course in life's banquet. It's a diversion. It's something that fills the chinks of one's time. How has this come about, that what was once considered to be so the highest form of love is now basically almost never recognized as having value? And Lewis is going to seek to advocate on its behalf, because Lewis himself was, as far as I can understand, a great friend, a very clubbable man. He was described by Tolkien, liked by many, disliked, of course, by some as well, but to his acquaintances very much the good friend. But there are a variety of causes. One of them is our understanding of human nature in biological terms, and the idea of ourselves as part of, and so not just in biological terms, but in terms of evolutionary, of a species, of a herd animal. This in particular will undermine the idea of friendship, because a friendship is a voluntary body that resists the coercion of collectivist pressures, and so it's inimical to them. And so therefore totalitarians always are hostile towards friendship, or voluntary associations for that matter. But of all of the associations that there exist, friendship is the most obviously voluntary of such. And so he says that it is the non-natural quality in friendship that goes far to explain why it was exalted in ancient and medieval times, and has come to be made light of in our own. The deepest and most permanent thought of those ages was ascetic and world-renouncing. Nature and emotion and the body were feared in the ancient world as dangers to our souls, or despised as degradations of our human status. Inevitably, that sort of love was most prized, which seemed most independent or even defiant of our human status. Inevitably, that sort of love, affection and eros were too obviously connected with our nerves, and most obviously that we shared with the brutes. It didn't distinguish human beings from the animals. And so your friendship was luminous, tranquil, rational, voluntary. All of these things were made us most like angels. But then, he says, came romanticism and, quote, tearful comedy, and the return to nature, and the exaltation of sentiment, and in their train all that great wallow of emotion, which, though often criticized, has lasted ever since. Finally, the exaltation of instinct, the dark gods in the blood, whose hierophants may be incapable of male friendship. Under this new dispensation, all that had once commanded this love now begins to work against it. And B.F. Skinner, with his attack on Lewis, will be attacking precisely this. There was not blood and guts enough about it to attract the primitivists. It looked thin and emaciated. It was the sort of vegetarian substitute for the more organic loves. And then there are other causes. Those that see human life as a development out of animal and so forth. He's going to get back into his critique of Darwinism, the way that Darwinism is necessitarian. It has no room for free will, so it will also diminish our appreciation for friendship in as much as it is cloven to or adhered to by its advocates. Freedom and which is one of the basis of friendship, will be diminished as a consequence. And yet he notes in the ancient world it was most certainly obviously prized, and we can see that not only amongst the pagans, but even amongst biblical figures like David and Jonathan, where they prize this. So it's the least biological of loves. And both the individual and the community can survive without it, furthermore. But there is something else, he says, often confused with friendship, which the community does not need. Something which, though not friendship, is the matrix of friendship. And what is that? Well, it's the separation of men from women, he says. It's not necessary, but it's something that's the matrix of friendships. In early communities, the cooperation of the males as hunters or fighters were no less necessary than the begetting and rearing of children. And in that, they would be talking shop. They would enjoy one another's company. We braves, we hunters, we're bound together by a shared skills, shared danger. There are jokes. There's all that sort of thing. The same thing happens amongst women, he says. But that idea of the intermixing of the two sexes is also a way of undermining the matrix being the womb for friendship. And companionship, that companionship is the matrix for friendship, but it does not constitute friendship. And so he'll distinguish that from mere association. We people in North America, we call somebody a friend when we've just met them. Oh, is this my friend? This is a euphemism that degrades friendship. It's not a friend on Facebook. We have friends the instant we click on an icon for somebody that we've never clapped eyes upon. They become a friend instantly. Again, this is a euphemism. He's going to make further distinctions. Let me just repeat some of them. He says, lovers seek for privacy. Friends find this solitude about them, this barrier between them and the herd, whether they want it or not. They would be glad to reduce it. The first two would be glad to find a third. One of the famous ways he describes it is lovers look at one another. Friends never look at one another. They look shoulder to shoulder towards some common interest or good. So this is characteristic of friendship. And he says, in a circle of true friends, each man is simply what he is. He stands for nothing but himself. And no one cares 2 pence about somebody else's family, possession, class, income, race, or previous history. And it's interesting how inclusive friendship is in an area that prizes inclusion as ours does. It has no value nonetheless for friendship. And why is that? Because it wants inclusion with necessity. And those two things don't go together. The inclusion of friendship and necessity are chalk and cheese. There is no mixing there. And it may be that we so desire inclusion precisely because we so lack friendship. But he says that in true friendship, those superficial distinctions matter not at all. Of course, you will get to know what most of these about most of these in the end, but you learn about them casually. They will come out bit by bit. They'll furnish an illustration or an analogy or serve as pegs for an anecdote, never for their own sake. This is the kingliness of friendship. We meet like sovereign princes or independent states, abroad on neutral ground, freed from our own contexts. This love, essentially, ignores not only our physical bodies, but that whole embodiment which consists of our family, job, past, and connections. At home, besides being Peter or Jane, we also bear a general character, husband or wife, brother or sister, chief, colleague, or subordinate, not among our friends. It is an affair of disentangled or stripped minds. Eros will have naked bodies, friendship, naked personalities. So this is the glory of friendship. And as he says, it is a school of virtue. It exists in most periods, and it can be found between among men and also among women in an age where men and women mix and don't allow for these freedoms to speak freely. It increasingly does not exist at all. And friendship, he says, was once regarded as something that raised us almost above humanity. This love free from instinct, and note again, once we talked about instinct as being the driving force for all of our desires and affections, it no longer will permit the very idea of a voluntary association. It will always push us towards need loves. It will not admit the very possibility, even theoretically, of the thing which is the very basis of a friendship. So he says this love, free from instinct, free from all duties, but those which love as freely seem almost wholly free from jealousy and free without qualification from the need to be needed is eminently spiritual. And so affection is taken as the image when God is represented as our Father. Eros, when Christ is represented as the bridegroom of the church. But friendship is very rarely represented in Christianity. And that's interesting as well. So Lewis is suggesting here that friendship is not so much talked in Christian circles, this voluntary free association. We notice it in the ancient world. Amongst pagans, it is strongly represented. On the other hand, there is a sort of free association that it is spoken of as friendship in the Gospels, and which Lewis really neglects to mention here. We're called friends of God. If we are in his family, we're also called friends of God, because there is an element of voluntary association to being part of the body of Christ. It's not just that we are the beloved, the bride of Christ. It's not just that we are born into a body and adopted into a family. So God is our Father, and we have that sort of filial relation, which makes it the affectionate type of relation. But there is also an element of the voluntary there. And so I think Lewis, to some degree, errs there when he suggests that friendship is not really a part of the Christian experience. All the same, I think what he says here is quite valuable. But let me move on to Eros then. Because Eros, of course, was the great theme of Till We Have Faces. It was not quite to the same degree, but to a certain degree, one of the considerations in the Great Divorce as well. He had spoken of erotic love as well as familial love. He had also discussed friendship there in the Great Divorce, but he used it to a lesser degree, and in large part because for the very reasons that I've just discussed here, or rather he has discussed, that it is so rarely experienced that it's almost difficult for him to present analogies which people will recognize and gravitate towards. But Lewis himself understood friendship very well, I think, and was therefore a great man to be a friend with, and had many friends. And furthermore, It's that very reason that I think Lewis is such a wonderful apologist, because Lewis does not demand of his audience. He invites them. He speaks of you as one speaks to a friend. He's trying to persuade you. He's not trying to coerce you. He's not trying to knock you over the head. He'll provide the best argument that he can, but he gives inviting analogies as one speaks to a friend by a fireside, giving a chat, in the most genial terms that I have met in any Christian writer, for which reason I love Lewis. But he moves on to Eros here. Now, this is the third form of love, just to recapitulate. The first love was called storge, or familiar love, or affection. The second love was called philia, which is what we commonly call friendship. The Philadelphia is the city of brotherly love, because Delphos is brother. Now he moves on to Eros. And he needs to make a distinction here, which I'm going to repeat here. By Eros, I mean, of course, that state which we call being in love. Or if you prefer, that kind of love which lovers are in. The reason he says this is he needs to distinguish it from sex, which we might immediately jump to. And he's going to spend some time here distinguishing being in love from the thing that is connected with it, the sexual act. And he said, some readers may have been surprised when, in an earlier chapter, I described affection as the love in which our experience seems to be closest to that of animals. Surely, it might be asked, are our sexual functions bring us equally close? This is quite true as regards human sexuality in general, but I am not going to be concerned with human sexuality simply as such. Sexuality makes part of our subject only when it becomes an ingredient in the complex state of being in love. So when he speaks of Eros, he's not speaking about sex. He is talking about the whole experience that we describe in connection with being in love. That sexual experience can occur without Eros, without being in love, and that Eros includes other things besides sexual activity, I take for granted, he says. And if you prefer to put it that way, I am inquiring not into the sexuality which is common to us and the beasts, or even common to all men, but into one uniquely human variation of it, which develops within love. That I call ethos. And so the carnal or the animally sexual equivalent within Eros, he is going to call Venus, just for the sake of distinction here. So the purely sexual, he's going to call Venus, whereas Eros is being in love. So sexuality may operate without Eros, or as a part of Eros. So the Venus may operate with Eros or without it. And the times and places, and this is even the case with marriage, the times and places in which marriage depends on Eros, he says, are in a small minority. Most of our ancestors were married off in early youth to partners chosen by their parents on grounds that had nothing to do with Eros, with being in love. They went to the act with no other fuel, so to speak, than plain animal desire, or the perpetuation of the family inheritance and family wealth. And they did right, said Lewis. Honest Christian husbands and wives obeying their fathers and mothers, discharging to one another their marriage debt, and bringing up families in the fear of the Lord. Conversely, this act, done under the influence of a soaring and iridescent Eros, which reduces the role of the senses to a minor consideration, may yet be plain adultery, may involve breaking a wife's heart, deceiving a husband, betraying a friend, polluting hospitality, and deserting your children. And he is going to describe that Eros as a powerful thing and a powerful misapplied thing. So Eros is rightly revered as a god. It's also leads to the greatest ruins that we will find in literature. And I could begin with in Dante, Paolo and Francesca, where adultery takes place. In the heroic works of King Arthur's court, Lancelot and Guinevere, the whole courtly love tradition is rooted in in adultery, nonetheless, Eros is being worshipped, the ideal of love that will lead us to betray all other loves and make us fiends. If we want a more contemporary equivalent of it, we could probably point to Tolstoy's great work, Anna Karenina. But he says, to the evolutionist, Eros, that is the human variation, will be something that grows out of Venus. So out of sex, Eros comes. A late complication and development of the immemorial biological impulse. He's going to debunk this. He says that the idea does not emerge from the instinct, from the sexual thing. He says marriage and the marriage bed, not the marriage. Oh, so let me, I'm reading out of here's his summary in response to the evolutionists. Sexual desire without Eros wants it, namely sex. The thing itself. Eros wants the beloved. And the beloved is not the sexual act itself. It's the beloved that is wanted. And it can be idealized in that sense. So Eros has a wonderfully, and it transforms what is fundamentally a need pleasure into the most appreciative of all pleasures. It's the thing about which poetry is written. We have a Valentine's Day. To this day, we idealize romantic love for a reason, because it is the thing we most highly appreciate. And so when Paul, he says, and it can be commonly misunderstood, and he says that it has been widely held in the past, and is perhaps held by many unsophisticated people today, that the spiritual danger of Eros arises almost entirely from the carnal element within it, that is, from the sex. That Eros is noblest or purest when Venus is reduced to a minimum. The older moral theologians, Lewis responds, certainly seem to have thought the danger we chiefly had to guard against in marriage was that of a soul-destroying surrender to the senses, to having sex. It will be noticed, however, that St. Paul in Scripture speaks rather differently. St. Paul dissuading his converts from marriage says nothing about that side of the matter, except to discourage prolonged abstinence from Venus. 1 Corinthians 7, verse 5. What he fears is preoccupation, the need of constantly pleasing, that is, considering one's partner, the multiple distractions of domesticity. It is marriage itself, not the marriage bed, that will be likely to hinder us from waiting uninterruptedly on God. Note that distinction. Very interesting and very important. Now, the real spiritual danger to God is in that. That should be idealized and made into an object of worship. But it's not the sex that's the problem here. And there's no danger of sex being made divinized per se. It's the idealization of the other. And again, Paul is not speaking about Eros there even per se. He's simply talking about the cares and concerns of marital life interfering there. But he doesn't speak about the marital bed per se. He's not concerned with sex. But the seriousness of Eros has a fourfold allegorical weight, which I think he describes here on page 91 in my book, which I think is very interesting here. But he has another go at the psychologist here, and I want to spend just 2 seconds to recapitulate that, because he says that in the psychological age, so much has been made of Eros and romantic love that it is taken with the sort of seriousness that it misunderstands the nature of Eros and of Venus. So one author tells us that Venus should recur through the married life in a solemn sacramental rhythm. A young man to whom I had described as pornographic, a novel that he much admired, replied with genuine bewilderment, "Pornographic? But how can it be? It treats the whole thing so seriously." as if a long face were a sort of moral disinfectant. Our friends who harbor dark gods, like D.H. Lawrence and the Pillar of Blood school, attempt seriously to restore something like the phallic religion. Our advertisements, at their sexiest, paint the whole business in terms of the rapt, the intense, the swoony, devout, seldom a hint of gaiety. And the psychologists have so bedeviled us with the infinite importance of complete sexual adjustment and the all but impossibility of achieving it, that I could believe that some young couples now go to it with the complete works of Freud, Kraft, Ebbing, Havelock Ellis, and Dr. Stopes spread out on bed tables all around them. So sex has been taken so seriously that Eros is never had, and Venus herself is not appreciated. And so he notes in terms of literature that Venus always involves an element of comedy and mischievousness. And so if you look at A Midsummer Night's Dream, for example, there are four sets of lovers, and there are the commoners that are set alongside the aristocratic lovers, and there's the king and the queen, and there's also the king and queen of the fairies there, but there's the commoners' love. And remember the work of Robin Goodfellow, Puck, the mischievous aspect of love, and note that love is often the theme in domestic comedies, Shakespeare's comedies. And he says this is appropriate because real sexual love that involves both Venus and Eros always has an element of comedy about it, but it certainly involves an appreciation for the body, even if it is what St. Francis calls the body, namely brother ass. There's something embarrassing about having bodies. And he says that lovers, unless their love is very short-lived, again and again feel an element not only of comedy, not only of play, but even of buffoonery in the body's expression of Eros. So Eros is an ideal to which we aspire, and an idealization, the actual act of sex, is nothing like that. And there's a comic disjuncture from this, which is the basis of much of our humor, at least historically. And I note in our day that very little of that really remains. And he says it's better, and in the old comedies of old, the lyric loves of the hero and the heroine are at once parodied and corroborated by some much more earthly affair between a touchstone and an Audrey, or a valet and a chambermaid, or Bottom and Titania, if you will. And remember, in Midsummer Night's Dream, that exactly is what goes on. So there's a lot of jokes and very, very low bodily humor that is associated with this. And Lewis says this is better. This really understands the nature of Eros and its connection with Venus. And he says, here's the phrase, far better plant it foursquare within the drama of Eros as comic relief than pretend you haven't noticed it, or to take it so seriously that you can never laugh at it. For indeed, we require this relief. The poetry is there as well as the unpoetry, the gravity of Venus as well as her levity, the gravis ardor or burning weight of desire. Pleasure pushed to its extreme shatters us like pain. And he says, when natural things look most divine, the demoniac is just around the corner. So we mustn't take it too seriously. He also says in the act of love, we are not merely ourselves, but also representatives. And so for that reason, when Paul in Ephesians 5 is speaking of the relationship between a man and a wife, he speaks of the relations of Christ to his church, the bridegroom for the bride. So there's a representative nature of Eros that we don't find in storge love, familiar love, or in philia love, but it is here. There's a representative nature here. And it transcends, there's an element in which we become our true selves in this by analogy. So now we're moving up the ladder in the terms of the natural loves towards divine love because it seems to be more representative. It's getting nearer. Remember that what I said about the outset. You can be near by image or near by journey, and here we're getting nearer by journey. And he says, some will think it strange I should find an element of ritual or masquerade in that action, which is often regarded as the most real, the most unmasked, and sheerly genuine thing we ever do. And then he retorts, are we not our true selves when naked? Or they ask. And his response is, in a sense, no. The word naked, and here he speaks as a medievalist, the word naked was originally a past participle. The naked man was the man who had undergone the process of naking, that is, of stripping or peeling. You use the verb of nuts and fruit. You're going to nake the nut or nake the fruit. Time out of mind, the naked man has seemed to our ancestors not the natural, but the abnormal man. Not the man who has abstained from dressing, but the man who has been, for some reason, undressed. And it is a simple fact, anyone can observe it at men's bathing places, that nudity emphasizes a common humanity and soft pedals what is individual. In that way, we are more ourselves when clothed. By nudity, the lovers cease to be solely John and Mary. The universal he and she are emphasized. You could almost say they put on nakedness as a ceremonial robe or as the costume for a charade. For we must still be aware, and never more than when we thus partake of the pagan sacrament in our love, passages of being serious in the wrong way. The Sky Father himself is only a pagan dream of one far greater than Zeus and far more masculine than the male. And a mortal man is not even the Sky Father and cannot really wear his crown, only a copy of it. Does it done in tinseled paper. I do not say this in contempt. I like ritual. I like private theatricals. I even like charades. Paper crowns have their legitimate and, in the proper context, their serious uses. They are not, in the last resort, much flimsier, if imagination mend them, than all earthly dignities. So there's an element in the mere nakedness and of actually being clothed in a ritualistic position, which pulls us towards the analogy of the love of Christ. Now, I wanted to get into, but I'm going to, for lack of time, I'm going to dispense with this. But he very much goes after the idea, and this is on page 100 and 101 of my version here. He goes after Shavian romanticism, which sees Eros as a sort of evolutionary appetite. And I think his takedown of George Bernard Shaw and also Richard Dawkins on this is quite powerful. But I will skip over it again for the lack of lack of time here. One final comment. He says nature gives content to the word glory. So we can talk about the glory of God seen in the firmament, the sense of space. We can talk about the glory of God seen in the beauty of the landscape. So glory has a sense of content in the natural world, whereas Eros gives content to the idea of charity, and that's where we're going to move to now, to the idea of charity. Charity is the fourth and final of the loves that Lewis addresses, and charity is the greatest of the four loves. And in many ways, it is, while at the top of the ladder of love, the climax, as it were, it is also to some degree unlike those. It is not a natural love. And the reason why it is that the others have, this love, charity, or agape, to use the Greek word, is the destination, because agape love characterizes the triune love of God towards us, and it's something that we do not naturally have at all. It is gift love. It is grace. It is something that we receive and we have no capacity to give in and of ourselves. So the natural loves have all been self-sufficient, or rather they are not self-sufficient, and he's shown that in some ways they anticipate this love, but they also demonstrate their inadequacy and their need for another helping love to pull them upwards the ladder along the journey, to go back to Augustine's analogy that I began the lecture with. So the natural loves are not self-sufficient. And here he just has an absolutely fascinating discussion here of, to my mind, the relation of culture to nature, and the relation of the three loves he's described earlier to love divine. So the relation, in other words, of storge, philia, and eros to agape. And here it is. He says, this is not to belittle the natural loves, but to indicate where their real glory lies. It's no disparagement to a garden to say that it will not fence and weed itself, nor prune its own fruit trees, nor roll and cut its own lawns. A garden is a good thing. But that is not the sort of goodness it has. It will remain a garden, as distinct from a wilderness, only if someone does all these things to it. Its real glory is of a quite different kind. The very fact that it needs constant weeding and pruning bears witness to that glory. It teems with life. It glows with color and smells like heaven, and it puts forward at every hour of a summer day beauties which man could never have created and could not even on his own resources have imagined. If you want to see the difference between its contribution and the gardener's, put the commonest weed it grows side by side with his hoes, rakes, shears, and packs of weed killer. You have put beauty, energy, and fecundity besides dead, sterile things. Just so. Put our decency and common sense show gray and death-like besides the geniality of love. And when the garden is in its full glory, the gardener's contributions to that glory will still have been, in a sense, paltry compared with those of nature. So all of our efforts, all of our loves, for all of their glory, they are paltry compared to this love. So in a sense, they're 1, 2, 3, 4 and there's a height, but in a sense, he's saying this one is so incomparably greater, it almost lacks, it ought not to be a comparison. It's so much greater. And here he comes to what, for my mind, this is why I said when he was discussing a mere Christianity and talking about the life of God and the way of receiving the life. And at the end of book 2, he talks about, in the 5th chapter, he talks about the means of receiving the life of God in terms of faith, in terms of baptism, in terms of communion. He didn't prioritize them, but here he demonstrates his awareness of how essential grace is. And faith is the very thing that is received by grace, and grace alone. And so I almost think that his later understanding represented in the four loves is a corrective to the way he represented it in mere Christianity. But that would divert me from representing Lewis's views fully, and I'm fast running to the end of my time here, so let me not move aside from that. But he says, without life springing from the earth, without rain, light, and heat descending from the sky, he, the gardener, could do nothing. When he's done all, he is merely encouraged here and discouraged there, powers and beauties that have a different source. But his share, though small, is indispensable and laborious. When God planted a garden, he set a man over it and set the man under himself. Dominion mandate, Genesis 1:28, right? Be fruitful, multiply, fill and subdue the earth, right? That's the dominion mandate, to cultivate the earth, make of the wilderness a garden, to make of, when he planted the garden of our nature and caused the flowering, fruiting loves to grow there, he set our will to dress them. Compared with them, it is dry and cold. And unless his grace comes down like the rain and the sunshine, we shall use this tool to little purpose. Now here he's probably has in mind, in the back of his mind, Isaiah 55 verses 10 and 11, referring to the grace of God. I'll just read the lines from Isaiah. For as the rain and the snow come down from heaven, and do not return there, but water the earth, bringing it forth and sprout, giving seed to the sower and bread to the eater, so shall my word be that goes out from my mouth. It shall not return to me empty, but it shall accomplish that which I purpose, and shall succeed in the thing for which I sent it. So unless God's grace comes down like the rain and the sunshine, we shall use this tool of gardening or cultivating to little purpose. But its laborious and largely negative services are indispensable. They are needed. And so we need to cultivate our natural loves. All the same, they are in the same way that I gave the analogy of the ordinate or the cardinal virtues, or the natural virtues, which the ancient world recognized, are a part of the 7 virtues. They are nonetheless the common virtues. They're not the virtues connected with God's love, and the God's love is faith, hope, and charity. Here we're specifically talking about charity. This is a love that is not of the world. It's love come down. And he says, hitherto hardly anything has been said in this book about our natural loves as rivals to the love of God. But they are actually and can be rivals. And the reason why he delays that, he gets into here. He says that it's dangerous to press upon a man the duty of getting beyond earthly love when his real difficulty lies in getting so far as realizing that he needs that. And he says it's no doubt easy enough to love the fellow creature less and to imagine that this is happening because we are learning to love God more. But we don't learn to love God more by loving the creature less. That's not how it works. It rather, what's the great commandment? Love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your mind, all your strength. And the second is like it, love your neighbor as yourself. Now, we cannot love a creature too much. We can only love a creature inordinately. That would be the problem. But the way we love a creature ordinately is we love God first. And this is what we need to understand here about agape, is that it is a love that is the fulfillment of all the other loves. And the goal of the journey, that Augustine says, is what we ought to be truly enjoying, and everything else along the way, including these 3 other types of loves, ought to be using with that purpose in mind. So he says it's no doubt easy enough to love the fellow creature less and to imagine that what we're doing is loving God more, when the real reason may be quite different. We may only be mistaking the decays of nature for the increase of grace. So I don't love this person anymore. Oh, I must be getting more godly. He said this is absurd. So he needed to point out how the loves themselves are actually good. There is a good love in there. And he says there's a second reason. The loves prove that they are unworthy to take the place of God by the fact that they cannot even remain themselves and do what they promise to do without God's help. That's why he went with it in the order that he went with it as well. And in this, he's following the well-trodden path that Dante does as well in his Divine Comedy. He begins in Mount Purgatory on his way up towards paradise. So the 4 temporal cardinal virtues are represented there on Mount Purgatory. And at that point, Virgil leaves him and Dante goes onwards and upwards, accompanied by Beatrice, and experiences faith, hope, and love. But he says that even for their own sakes, the loves must submit to be second things if they are to remain the things they want to be. In this sense, the loves are taller, he says, when they bow. And the natural loves are inadequate on their own merits, and so they need to submit to a greater love than they in order to be what they need to do. Now, it's not the case then that these other loves disappear entirely, but rather that grace then perfects the natural loves. It's not that these other things need to disappear, but rather that grace makes Storge love, truly, its correct nature, and philia, its correct nature, and eros, its correct nature. So grace perfects nature, and it, to some degree, makes nature natural, if you will. But his wonderful phrase here is, the loves are taller when they bow. I love that. They bow to the love which is love. And now he begins his critique of Augustine. I'm going to skip over it because I think he misunderstands Augustine here, and takes one phrase out of his autobiography, Confessions, and talks about how it would be better never to have loved at all, basically, because a man dies and so forth. And Lewis says it's impossible. This is a Stoic. He's inherited this from the pagans, etc., and so forth. I think it's quite clear from reading the other works by Augustine and even later passages in Confessions. He fully and rightly understands how our loves are anticipations of this. And even that passage that I read in De Doctrina understands all loves in terms of being anticipations of true love. They're not to be loved in and of themselves, but they are to be loved for God's sake, and they are thereby lovable. So inordinate, he says, they are, the problem is not that they are loves, but rather they're inordinate loves. And what does he mean by this? It doesn't mean inordinately or insufficiently cautious, and it doesn't mean too big. We can't love a person too much. It means that we love him too much in proportion to our love of God. We should love God more than anything else. And we can love those other things as much as we desire, but God needs to be loved more than those things. And for which reason we're told we must hate our mother and father, perhaps, in order to follow him. There's a rivalry there between the two, which exists. And now he comes towards the end of this, to the foot of the last steep ascent. Remember the metaphor of the journey. And he talked about this, going to the top of the mountain or the cliff and looking down on the village. And there's the likenesses of these loves to the love of God, but they don't get any closer. Whereas here, if we're going to follow the agape love, we're now following it towards its destination. And now we're at the foot of a steep mountain. And here he says, and the book is going to try and make it, we must try to relate the human activity that are called loves to that love which is God a little more precisely than we've yet done. The precision can, of course, be only that of a model or a symbol, certain to fail us in the long run, and even while we use it, require correction from other models. The humblest of us in a state of grace can have knowledge by acquaintance, connaître, some tasting of love himself. But even man at his highest sanctity, naturally he is speaking, and intelligence, has no direct knowledge of the ultimate being, only analogies. We cannot see light, though by light we can see things. Statements about gods are extrapolations from the knowledge of other things, which the divine illumination enables us to know. So it is the agape love that will allow us to see the other loves rightly. So again, he now goes to the line with which he began this: God is love. Or even further, herein is love, not that we loved God, but that he loved us. And I would add, and gave himself as a propitiation for sin. But if he threw that in there, then he would be contradicting his presentation of the atonement in mere Christianity. But I digress. Here he's going to talk about the doctrine of the Trinity. Now he wants to present here, I'm on page 116 here, the idea of the ontological Trinity as opposed to the economic Trinity. Now the ontological Trinity is the Trinity, the triune character of God and God's loving activity as it exists before the creation of the world. It's entirely satisfied. God is in and of himself satisfied. And he says that God, in God there is no hunger that needs to be filled, only plenteousness that desires to give. The doctrine that God was under no necessity to create is not a piece of dry scholastic speculation. It is essential. Without it, we can hardly avoid the conception of what I can only call a managerial God. That God is there and he He needs us to keep himself busy. A being whose function or nature is to run the universe, or who stands to it as a headmaster to a school or a hotelier to a hotel. But to be sovereign of the universe is no great matter to God. In himself at home in the land of the Trinity, he is sovereign of a far greater realm. We must keep always before our eyes the vision of Lady Julian of Norwich, in which God carried in his hand a little object like a nut. And that nut was all that is made. We are of little consequence to God in that sense. God needs nothing. He creates the universe, already foreseeing, or should we say seeing. There are no tenses in God, he says. The buzzing cloud of flies about the cross, the flayed back pressed against the uneven stake, the nails driven through the mesial nerves, the repeated incipient suffocation as the body droops, the repeated torture of back and arms as it is time after time, for breath's sake, hitched up. If I may dare the biological image, God is a host who deliberately creates his own parasites, causes us to be that we may exploit and take advantage of him. Herein is love. This is the diagram of love himself, the inventor of all loves. Note how Lewis brings it to the cross and talks about us as parasites and creation, the whole created order, as having nothing in itself of good other than the fact that God has made it good and called it good, but it's deprived of that, and we are like that. So God, as creator of nature, implants in us both gift loves and need loves. The gift loves, as he's already said, are natural images of himself, proximities to him by resemblance, so likenesses. They're this close to him from the top of the cliff down to the village. A devoted mother, a beneficent ruler, or a teacher may give us give and give, continually exhibiting the likeness without making the approach. Whereas the need loves, so far as I've been able to see, have no resemblance to the love which God is. They are rather correlatives or opposites, not as evil as the opposite of good, but rather as the form of a blancmange is to the form of the mold. So think of a mold, a jelly mold, and then when you remove the mold, what's left of the jelly? These are the need loves. They're approximations, they're likenesses in that sense. But in addition to those natural loves, God can bestow a far better gift, a supernatural love. And he communicates this to us of himself, working in a man in a wholly disinterested and desiring for the best in the object of love. And he says that human beings do this as well when they share God's love to other people. And he said, but divine gift love in the man enables him to love what is not naturally lovable. Lepers, criminals, enemies, morons, the sulky, the superior, and the sneering. This is a gift that only comes by the gift of grace, by the gift of the Holy Spirit. And there's a supernatural gift love that transforms in all of this. And Lewis here wonderfully represents grace and its workings in a man. So, and says what the grace gives is the full recognition, the sensible awareness, the complete acceptance, even with certain reservations, the glad acceptance of this need in us to be needed, to need God. We're aware of our need, and therefore we embrace God as he is, as the gift of love, as grace. And because we're aware of our sinful depravity, we also realize how much we need forgiveness. And because of that, we're willing to forgive others who even are criminals who have offended us wholly. And he says, for without grace, our wishes and our necessities are in conflict. Great subtlety and profundity here. But all of these will release us from our intrinsic sense of freedom or power or worth. And when we're released from all those claims that we have to be better than somebody else, or smarter than somebody else, or more powerful than somebody else, when we are released of all of those things by our awareness of our utter poverty before God, he says there's a paradox, and that is we we discover real freedom and real power and real worth, not because we possess them, but rather because God gives them. And because we know them to be, in another sense, not ours, but rather his. And yet they are so much ours because he's purchased them for us by the gift of his Son and by the washing of his blood. And because he's given it to us, it cannot be removed from us. And so this is the great grace and the great charity of agape love. And so there's a typology here. Divine love does not substitute itself for the natural, as if we had to throw away our silver to make room for the gold. The natural loves are summoned to become modes of charity while also remaining the natural loves they were. And so he says there's a sort of an echo or a rhyme or a corollary to the incarnation itself in even our understanding of all the three loves that he's described up to this point. And he says this need not surprise us, for the author of the incarnation was also the incarnate one. As Christ is perfect God and perfect man, the natural loves are called to become perfect charity. And also perfect natural loves. As God becomes man, not by conversion of the Godhead into flesh, but by the taking of the manhood into God, so here charity does not dwindle into merely natural love, but natural love is taken up into, made the tuned and obedient instrument of love himself. And so in our very instincts, appetites, and recreations, love has prepared for himself a body. And who is that body? It is none other than his people, we who are the bride of Christ, who he also calls his body. So with that, I leave you and see you next time.